Welcome back to The Price of Business. I'm your host, Kevin Price, talking to you about you and your business. Charles Cooke, he continues his conversation with me, author of the book, The Conservatarian Manifesto, and he's also a writer over there at National Review. What exactly is your role over at the National Review, by the way?
I'm a staff writer.
Staff writer.
So I write most days.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about what motivated you to write the book, beyond, the obvious demographics, the changes, and the crisis. When did you begin to see the need for the book? I guess that's a better question.
Well, the conservative movement has not managed to win a national election for almost 7 years now. And there is a growing feeling that they will struggle in that area. Now, as I point out in the book, they've done extremely well everywhere else. And it is rather annoying when I go on television and the presenter says to me, Republicans can't win, can they? Well, that's not true. They've won the majority of state houses. They've won the majority of the governorships. They have the strongest majority in the House of Representatives since the 20s, and they have a Senate majority. They also, although it doesn't always show itself, they also have a majority on the Supreme Court. But long term, it does seem as if that lock will be broken, and that it is possible there'll be another Democratic president in 2016. And I do not believe this is because younger Americans and Americans in general have suddenly moved to the left. On some questions, they certainly have, social issues, but not on everything else. In fact, some indices show that they're more conservative now in the public mood than they have been since the 50s. So I wanted to articulate a way forward for the right that could bring together the conservatives and the libertarians. Indeed, try to bring together Americans in general. The argument that I'm making here is geared toward ensuring that conservatives are well represented, or classical liberals are well represented in Washington. But it's also an attempt to try and bring Americans together by ceasing to elevate every issue to the national stage. And I argue very vehemently in the book for federalism, partly because I wish to achieve that, but partly because I think we're now living at a time in which the country is so diverse once again. I mean intellectually diverse by that. I don't care about race. That having one-size-fits-all solutions, having a strong national government, simply doesn't work. And so happily, the book is really complements itself in that the argument I make to fix the right is my argument for, in the long term, fixing America.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally concur. In fact, I wrote an article at Huffington Post about how if you believe in diversity, you ought to support federalism, shouldn't you?
Right.
I mean, that to me is perfect sense. If you want a diversity of perspectives, see, diversity has been so reduced to just an ethnic type position, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Diversity, if you want true diversity, it includes a lot of different, even a lot of different income groups, but certainly ideas, beliefs, and values. And, the original founders saw 50 different laboratories. Of course, it wasn't 50 back in 1788 when the Constitution was being ratified, but what would become 50 different laboratories that could be competitive with one another were the best ideas rising to the top. That makes so much sense rather than the collective mediocrity that comes when the state does this.
And on that, I think it's important the way you phrased it, because very often when we think about the states being laboratories, we think of there being essentially areas in which we can experiment with ideas before we take them national. And so if marijuana legalization works in Colorado, you hear people suggesting, well, then we should pass a similar federal law. If Massachusetts healthcare law works for Massachusetts, well, then Obamacare should be implemented nationally. That's not really the point in federalism. That can happen. That can be a virtue. The point in federalism is to allow different people to live as they see fit. Much as the founders were worried that the Puritans of of New England and the Quakers of Pennsylvania and the slave-owning aristocracy in the South could not coexist under a one-size-fits-all government. Mm-hmm. We see today that the hipsters in Brooklyn and the Baptists in Mississippi do not share too many values, and that's fine. It is okay for Massachusetts to be one way and for Texas to be another. We don't have to try and make them the same.
Right. Yeah, and what I mean about stuff rising to the top would be states voluntarily doing that.
Right.
Because
Absolutely.
otherwise,
I think
you're never going to have
well.
that. You got to maintain that friction that friction of competitiveness. Because if everything becomes the same, then why improve? And a great example is healthcare. Where did socialized medicine work in any state? In Massachusetts, they were already doing rationing and were having price control issues before Obamacare, even as he boasted it as his model. In Hawaii, its socialist healthcare system had to be really done away with, abolished in less than a year because of how expensive it was. It never worked anywhere, and so it's really romantic to think it would work nationwide.
Yes, and of course what we're discussing at root here is the right of exit.
Yes.
There is a reason that Democratic politicians tend to like the federal government, and that is that they can impose their ideas and nobody can run away. If you put a $15 minimum wage in Los Angeles, as California, I think, is about to do, people can move. They can go to the outskirts of the city. But if you put a $15 minimum wage in nationally, well, nobody can leave. Nobody can respond rationally to that. And that is not only bad politics, but it's bad for a country that is supposed to be diverse and is supposed to be free.
Yeah, and what you do is you're going to create a permanent underclass that's always going to be dependent on government, which I think the Democrats make a living off of. The Democrats are into poverty business. If Americans became affluent, they'd have a serious problem. If all Americans became affluent. It's hard to make a living off of class warfare if everyone is moving upward and they know they're moving upward.
Well, we are certainly seeing with the inequality debate, the view that has been much mocked, and rightly so, from the right for years now. Mrs. Thatcher was making this case in 1990. We are seeing it said that it would be okay to limit growth. It would be okay to diminish the rich, diminish the economy, providing the gap between rich and poor was smaller. They would rather have a smaller gap and fewer wealthy people than a bigger gap but fewer poor people. And I think that is criminal.
Yeah. I think that the more people talk about the gap, the bigger the gap gets. And the more people talk about opportunity, the smaller the gap gets. And the more we focus on policy for opportunity rather than shrinking that gap, the more people are going to move up the ladder, which is ultimately what we all want.
It is what we all want. And it's worth saying that while I don't think income inequality is a problem in and of itself, what I care about is how the people at the bottom are living. Do they have food? Do they have clothes? Do they have a chance to improve themselves? The biggest change in inequality and in the condition of the poor has come when economies have been free.
Yeah.
We don't hear that very often. An example here, and of course I'm not suggesting that we go back to the Gilded Age in any meaningful sense of the word. But the Gilded Age is greatly maligned, despite the fact that for the average American, it was a remarkable improvement on their prior conditions. Now, no, we would not want people to live in the way they did in 1895, given that we know how people live in 2015. But if you'd said to the average person in 1870, by the year 1915, your conditions will be improved in these ways. We will have these instances of technology, the average wage will have gone up, and so on and so forth. They would have jumped at the chance. And that was not because government got involved.
Yeah. And, of course, if you look at the most prosperous countries in the world are also the freest countries in the world. Just look at the Pacific Rim. I mean, just look at case studies. How do you ignore the case study of North Korea versus South Korea? Now, I admit North Korea is a freak of nature, but I mean, it just shows you this is what freedom looks like with South Korea, certainly in the economic sphere. It has some weird social type policies and that type of thing, but in this economic sphere is among the freest countries in the world, and North Korea, of course, is probably the least free country in the world, and it's really a tale of two countries, to say the least. So what's the reception been on your book?
Positive. I was expecting pushback from both sides, and I've got a little bit. And when I say both sides, I mean conservatives and libertarians. But generally speaking, I'm encouraged, and I wonder, therefore, whether I might be onto something. Perhaps this is a blueprint for the future. Few people have said to me, you are just wrong, we need to do everything my way. Perhaps because we're so tired now of our common enemy, as you put it, statism, that these compromises, and there are compromises that would need to come from both sides. These compromises I'm talking about may be more attractive than they would have been in maybe 2004 or 5, when it looked as if the right was winning, and according to some pundits, was going to win forever.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, in 2004, I remember former Senate Majority Leader, the Democratic leader Mitchell, saying that the Republican Party the Democratic Party has become a minority party. It's become a regional party. That's what he said in 2004. So how quickly things change.
That's absolutely right. That is, of course, how the media works. The same thing was said in 2012 when Barack Obama was reelected.
Yeah.
This was it. Republicans were to go the way of the Whigs. Conservatism was dead. This was new progressive America. Well, not really. That's not how electoral politics ever works. And I doubt it will happen in the near future.
In spite of the Republicans' best efforts.
This is true.
All right. Charles Cooke, thanks so much for being with us, and thanks for letting me go along today. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Look up online, listener, to look up Conservatarian. It's really exactly like it sounds. Conservatarian, Manifesto. Read it. It's a phenomenal book. Or you could simply go online. What is your website? It's Conservatarian.com, right?
That's correct. That's correct.
Check it out. It's a great book. I enjoyed it. Must reading. If you want, unless you want on a national level our principles to be minority principles going forward, you really need to support this book, because I do believe that Mr. Cooke has created a bridge between the two different philosophies and electoral success. And thanks for doing that.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed this.
You bet, as did I. All right, when we come back, much more for you. I do want to remind you, best content here, including this interview, will be found over there at usdailyreview.com, the national news site. Stay tuned for more after this.